Chapter 13, Part 2 of How I Found Livingstone. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Anton Epp. How I Found Livingstone: Travels, Adventures and Discoveries in Central Africa, including 4 months residence with Dr. Livingstone. By Sir Henry M. Stanley. Chapter 13, Part 2. Our cruise on the Lake Tanganyika, exploration of the north end of the lake, the Rusizi is discovered to enter into the lake, return to Ujiji. After passing the low headland of Kisunwe, formed by the Kisunwe River, we came in view of Murembwe Cape, distant about 4 or 5 miles, the intervening ground being lowland, a sand and pebbly beach. Close to the beach are scores of villages, while the crowded shore indicates the populousness of the place beyond. About halfway between Cape Kisunwe and Murembwe is a cluster of villages called Bikari, which has a Mutwari who is in the habit of taking honga. As we were rendered unable to cope for any length of time with any mischievously inclined community, all villages having a bad reputation with the Wajiji were avoided by us. But even the Wajiji guides were sometimes mistaken, and led us more than once into dangerous places. The guides evidently had no objections to halt at Bikari, as it was the second camp from Mukungu, because with them a halt in the cool shade of plantains was infinitely preferable to sitting like carved pieces of wood in a cranky canoe. But before they stated their objections and preferences, the Bikari people called to us in a loud voice to come ashore, threatening us with the vengeance of the great Wami if we did not halt. As the voices were anything but siren-like, we obstinately refused to accede to the request. Finding threats of no avail, they had recourse to stones, and accordingly flung them at us in a most hearty manner. As one of them came within a foot of my arm, I suggested that a bullet be sent in return in close proximity to their feet. But Livingstone, though he said nothing, yet showed plainly enough that he did not quite approve of this. As these demonstrations of hostility were anything but welcome, and as we saw signs of it almost every time we came opposite a village, we kept on our way until we came to Murembwe Point, which, being a delta of a river of the same name, as well as protected by a breadth of thorny jungle, spiky cane, and a thick growth of reed and papyrus, from which the boldest Murundi might well shrink, especially if he called to mind that beyond this inhospitable swamp were the guns of the strangers his like had so rudely challenged. We drew our canoe ashore here, and, on a limited area of clean sand, Faraji, our rough and ready cook, lit his fire, and manufactured for us a supply of most delicious mocha coffee. Despite the dangers which still beset us, we were quite happy, and seasoned our meal with a little moral philosophy, which lifted us unconsciously into infinitely superior beings to the pagans by whom we were surrounded, upon whom we now looked down, under the influence of mocha coffee and moral philosophy, with calm contempt, not unmixed with a certain amount of compassion. The doctor related some experiences he had had among the people of similar disposition, but did not fail to ascribe them, with the wisdom of a man of ripe experience, to the unwise conduct of the Arabs and half-castes. In this opinion I unreservedly concur. From Murembwe Point, having finished our coffee and ended our discourse on ethics, we proceeded on our voyage, steering for Cape Senteki, which, though it was 8 or 10 miles away, we hoped to make before dark. The Wangwana pulled with right good will, but 10 hours went by, and the night was drawing near, and we were still far from Senteki. As it was a fine moonlit night, and we were fully alive to the dangerous position in which we might find ourselves, they consented to pull an hour or 2 more. About 1 p.m. we pulled inshore for a deserted spot, a clean shelf of sand, about 30 feet long by 10 deep, from which a clay bank rose about 10 or 12 feet above, while on each side there were masses of disintegrating rock. Here we thought that by preserving some degree of silence we might escape observation, and consequent annoyance, for a few hours, when, being rested, we might continue our journey. Our kettle was boiling for tea, and the men had built a little fire for themselves, and had filled their black earthen pot with water for porridge, when our outlooks perceived dark forms creeping towards our bivouac. Being hailed, they at once came forward and saluted us with the native wake. Our guides explained that we were Wangwana, and intended to camp until morning, when, if they had anything to sell, we should be glad to trade with them. They said they were rejoiced to hear this, and after they had exchanged a few words more, during which time we observed that they were taking mental notes of the camp, they went away. Upon leaving, they promised to return in the morning with food, and make friends with us. While drinking our tea, the lookouts warned us of the approach of a second party, which went through the same process of saluting and observing as the first had done. These also went away, over exuberant, as I thought, and were shortly succeeded by a third party, who came and went as the others had. From all this we inferred that the news was spreading rapidly through the villages about, and we noticed two canoes passing backwards and forwards with rather more haste than we deemed usual or necessary. We had good cause to be suspicious. It is not customary for people, at least between Ujiji and Zanzibar, to be about visiting and saluting after dark, under any pretence. It is not permitted to persons to prowl about camp after dark without being shot at, and this going backward and forward, this ostentatious exuberance of joy at the arrival of a small party of Wagwamna, which in many parts of Urundi would be regarded as a very common event, was altogether very suspicious. While the Doctor and I were arriving at the conclusion that these movements were preliminary to, or significant of, hostility, a fourth body, very boisterous and loud, came and visited us. Our supper had been by this time dispatched, and we thought it high time to act. The fourth party having gone with extravagant manifestations of delight, the men were hurried into the canoe, and, when all were seated, and the lookouts embarked, we quietly pushed off, but not a moment too soon. As the canoe was gliding from the darkened light that surrounded us, I called the Doctor's attention to several dark forms, some of whom were crouching behind the rocks on our right, and others scrambling over them to obtain good or better positions. At the same time, people were approaching from the left of our position in the same suspicious way, and directly a voice hailed us from the top of the clay bank overhanging the sandy shelf where we had lately been resting. "Neatly done!" cried the Doctor, as we were shooting through the water, leaving the discomfited would-be robbers behind us. Here again my hand was stayed from planting a couple of good shots, as a warning to them in the future from molesting strangers, by the mere presence of the Doctor, who, as I thought, if it were actually necessary, would not hesitate to give the word. After pulling 6 hours more, during which we had rounded Cape Sentekyi, we stopped at the small fishing village of Mugeyo, where we were permitted to sleep unmolested. At dawn we continued our journey, and about 8 a.m. arrived at the village of the friendly Mutware of Magala. We had pulled for 18 hours at a stretch, which at the rate of 2.5 miles per hour would make 45 miles. Taking bearings from our camp at Cape Magala, one of the most prominent points in travelling north from Ujiji, we found that the large island of Muzimu, which had been in sight ever since rounding Cape Bangwe near Ujiji Bunder, bore about south-southwest, and that the western shore had considerably approached to the eastern, the breadth of the lake being at this point about 8 or 10 miles. We had a good view of the western highlands, which seemed to be of an average height, about 3,000 feet above the lake. Luhanga Peak, rising a little to the north of west from Magala, might be about 500 feet higher, and Sumburizi, a little north of Luhanga, where lived Imruta, Sultan of Uvira, the country opposite to this part of Urundi, about 300 feet higher than the neighbouring heights. Northward from Magala Cape, the lake streamed away between two chains of mountains, both meeting in a point about 30 miles north of us. The Warundi of Magala were very civil, and profound starers. They flocked around the tent door, and most pertinaciously gazed on us, as if we were subjects of the most intense interest, but liable to sudden and eternal departure. The Mutware came to see us late in the afternoon, dressed with great pomp. He turned out to be a boy whom I had noticed in the crowd of gazers, for his good looks and fine teeth which he showed, being addicted to laughing continually. There was no mistaking him, though he was now decorated with many ivory ornaments, with necklaces, and with heavy brass bracelets and iron wire anklets. Our admiration of him was reciprocated, and in return for our 2 doti of cloth and a fundo of samsam, he gave a fine, fat, and broad-tailed sheep and a pot of milk. In our condition, both were extremely acceptable. At Magala we heard of a war raging between Mukamba, for whose country we were bound, and Warumshanya, a sultan of an adjoining district, and we were advised that, unless we intended to assist one of these chiefs against the other, it would be better for us to return. But as we had started to solve the problem